Hashem, today's daf is Masechta Zevachim Daf Gimel, and we're going to start from daf Beis and Beis about oops 4 lines. How do you get this down? Oh, 4 lines from the bottom. Okay, so about 5 lines from the bottom. Here we go. Vagabe get. So we're talking about over here that we know that if you shech an animal and not thinking about anything, though the animal is kosher. So let's say it's a chatas, and the kohen is shechting the animal, and he's not thinking about anything. Here's the kohen shechting an animal, and he's not thinking about anything. So the carbon is kosher. However, regarding a get, let's say you have a sefer, and he's writing a get, and he says Reuven is divorcing Sarah. So even if he doesn't know which Ruvain is divorcing Sarah, the get is possible. So the Gemara wants to know, where do you see that in the Mishnayos? V'gabe get the stomach possible manolan. Where do you see that in the Mishnayos regarding a get, that if you write it without the intention of anybody, how do you know it's not a kosher get? Ilema, are you going to say Mahadatan that we learned? We have a Mishnah, source in the Mishnah. A man was walking in the street. Vishama Seifrim, and he heard scribes, Makrim, reading out loud. It was a school of scribes. Ish Pliny, Gerish Plinius, Mimakam Pliny. So and so is divorcing this lady from this place. Oh, and he heard them over practicing on this writing a get. V'ama, and he said, wait a second, Zeshmi v'zeshem this is my name, the name of my wife. I probably come from that place. So he's going to go into their garbage and take out that get and use it. So the Gemara says that Mishnah says, possible garish boy, it would be possible to divorce his wife. Why? Probably because the Seifrim, when they wrote it, they didn't have intention to write it for him, the one that found it. So therefore, we see from there that a get that you write without the intention of who you're writing it for, the real person, so it's an invalid get. So here's the proof from the Mishnah. So the Gemara says, not so fast. It's not a proof from the Mishnah. Dilma, let us say, maybe K'tura Papa. The reason why it's not a kosher get over there, because it wasn't written for a get at all. The Amar Papa said, Hocha b'soifrim hu asuyin lehislami doskinim. We are referring to scribes that are learning how to write. The loy ichtev l'shum krisis klal. It wasn't written for a divorce at all. So here, what the Gemara is basically saying is that a get has to be written for a get. That's step one. Then you have to write the people who you're writing it for, the name and the name of the person who's gonna be written in the get. So so the Gemara understood that the reason why that get was puzzle, or that piece of paper was puzzle, is because it wasn't written for a get at all. But how do I know that if a get was written for a get, but you didn't, the names, you wrote stam names, you wrote names, but not knowing which names you're writing for, the person behind the name. How do you know that is not going to be kosher? So we go to another proof from the Mishnayos. Elamiha, let's go from here. Top of Gimel Lamed Aleph. Yes, Al Kain. Furthermore, because of Lagaris Ishta, a man writes a get to divorce his wife. Vinimlach. And he changed his mind. Now, when the guy went to the Sefer and he says, my name is Reuven, and I'm divorcing my wife, Sarah. He wasn't 100% sure he wanted to divorce his wife, but he wrote a get. So maybe he wrote it like a little bit stam. And then he changed his mind. Matzah ben Ira, and he found a person from his city. V'amalei, and he said to that person, Shmi kishimcha, my name is like your name. V'shem ishti kishem ishtecha, and my wife's name is like your wife. In other words, my name is Reuven, your name is Reuven. Your wife's name is Sarah, my wife's name is Sarah. Use my get. I'm not using it. Pasa legarish boy. The second guy is invalid to divorce his wife. Why? Because it was written. When it was written stam. It wasn't written for this person. So we see from here that a get that's written without knowledge of the person who you're writing it for, it's an invalid get. Answers the Gemara, not so fast. Dilma shani hasam. Over there, it's different. The intik le l'shem gerish and dahu. it was actually written for the first guy's wife and the first guy as a husband. So it's connected to that person. So therefore, it's invalid. However, if a sofer has nobody in front of him and just writes a get, l'shem gerushin, and he just writes two names there, how do you know that's invalid get? Elamaha. We'll get from this case. Yes, Alkane, another case that goes one step further. Yesh lo shtei nashim. Man has two wives, shishmeseim shavas, that have the same name. Let's say they're both named Sarah. But one is older and one's younger. Cost of Lagaris is Gdela. If the get was written for the older Sarah, Lo Yagarish by Saktana, he cannot use it for the younger Sarah. So we see from there, a guy probably didn't know which Sarah he wanted to write it for, and he told his wife, write it that I'm divorcing Sarah. But he thought of he's going to use it for the Gedola, but he wasn't 100%. It says you can't divorce the younger one. So we see from there, if a get wasn't written, if a get was written sort of anonymously, without anybody, without intention, it is invalid. So here's your proof. So Gemara says, no, the Ilma over there, Shana Asim, it's different. The intik le l'shem gerushin dahi. It is connected to the gerushin of the older one, because the husband's original intention was to use it for the older Sarah. So it wasn't like a stam. It's like a change. It's like a pivot. You're changing it from the older one to use it for the younger Sarah. That's what's wrong. But again, where do you see that if I'm writing a Sefer is writing a get without anybody in mind? How do you know you can't decide later on? Ella Maha, I have a much from this proof. Yes, okay, let's take it one step further. The Mishnah says, Elma Lavler, a person says to a scribe, he says to the Sefer, I have two wives named Sarah, and write the get, and I'll decide later on which wife to give it to. So that's stam, pasal garish boy. It's invalid to use that as a get. So the girl's name, the lady's name, when the Sefer wrote it, he didn't know which girl is going to be using it. He didn't know which lady is going to be using it, and nevertheless, it's possible to use as a get. So therefore, there you see, answers the Gemara, Dilma, Shana Hasam over there is different. The Ein Breira. Here, it's a little bit different, because you can't decide later on to clarify something later on. That's the problem. You see, Reuven was divorcing his wife Sarah. He didn't know which Sarah, the older Sarah or the younger Sarah. And he said, I'm going to decide later on. So this is a concept called Ein Breira. You can't clarify something later on, because we know it's for this Sarah or that Sarah. So you can't clarify it later on. Now, that wouldn't invalidate a get that was written for nobody. It was written for nobody. It just says Reuven is divorcing Sarah, but it doesn't know which Reuven, which Sarah. How do I know a sofer can't sell that? Hi, Lewis. We're just in the middle of Gimel Amud Aleph, and we're discussing the concept, and we're finishing up this discussion. We want to know the source. If a scribe is writing a get, and he doesn't know who he's writing it for. He's writing Reuven is divorcing Sarah, and then he hopes to put it out in the store and sell it for somebody, a Reuven, who has a wife named Sarah. How do you know that's an invalid get? He wrote it for a get. That's called a get without intention. How do you know that's an invalid get? You can't do that. Elamaha, we can see it from here. Akoisef, the Mishnah says, and this is the source. Akoisef taisegit. Guy wants to make a form of a get. Just like they sell in the Judaica Plus, they sell you a ksuba, right, with the words not filled in, the main part of it. So if you want to make forms of getting that you want to sell, so then you can do that. But the Mishnah says, you can't put in names. You can't put a name like keychains, You have to leave out the place for the man and the place for the woman, the place for the edim, and the place where you're going to put the date. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel, Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, Av tzarich sheiniach malkaim harayat muteres l'chol adam. You have to leave the place that you can say you are permitted to anybody. So we see that even a get that it's written, if you're not going to have writing a name and not having in mind who is behind the name, so then it's an invalid get. And that's why when you sell forms of get, you have to leave over the spot that's the place for the man and for the place for the woman. That settles it. Now, to Rami Milsachrita, another question that has to do with Zvachim and Gittin. You would think they're unrelated, but here it is. Umi Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rav, and here's, I'm going to pull it up on a picture over here. The picture shows a guy shechting a carbon. It's a chatas, right? It's a chatas. It's supposed to be a chatas. It's a sheep for a chatas, let's say. And if the Mishnah says that Rav says a chiddush, if he has in mind that if he thinks that if he says that I'm shechting it for an oila, then it's an invalid carbon. You have to throw the animal out. If he says I'm shechting it to be sold in the butcher shop as chulin, then it's good. You could finish it up as a chatas. And the question is why? If you're thinking that it's chulin, why is it a good carbon? Why could you continue it as a good carbon? That's the question. So the Gemara wants to know what's the reason. The reason is, so the Gemara has this svara that the reason is because when you shecht it to a similar carbon, so that invalidates the carbon because it's a chatas and you're trying to turn it into an oila. That invalidates it. However, when you're in the Beis Hamikdash shechting a carbon and you say, "Oh, I'm shechting it as chulin, as a non-carbon," that's so preposterous and so out of whack. It doesn't interrupt the original thought that it's a chatas. So therefore, it will be good. The Gemara says, so that's what the Gemara says. So the Gemara says like this: Ama Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav, Chata sheshachtu l'shem oila. If you slaughter a chatas, saying that it's going to be an oila, pisula, that it's pasal, because you're slaughtering it and naming it another carbon. Shachtu l'shem chulin, but if you name it as chulin, as a non-carbon, kishera, the animal's kosher, and you can do the zrika, and you could do the halacha, which I want to show you a picture. A guy is carrying the blood, and he's sprinkling the blood on the mizbeach. You can do all that l'shem chatas. You don't have to throw the animal out. But now, alma, so we see from here, the mina machraba, because you're thinking of something, a similar carbon animal, that destroys, that basically interrupts the original thought of the animal. And that's why the animal is puzzle. When you think oilen, it's a chatas, it puzzles the chatas. The lav mina, but if it's not the same carbon, if it's not even in the ballpark, loy machruvra, it doesn't interrupt the original thought. And therefore, if you think that it's a chulin, if you say that this animal should be a chulin animal, it doesn't interrupt your original intention as a chata, so it's still kosher. Says the Gemara, Minu, I'll ask you a contradiction. Mishnah says, Kol a get shaloi nichtav shaloi l'shem isha pasal. If a get that wasn't written for any woman, for not the sake of the woman, pasal, right? If a get wasn't written for this woman, it was written for somebody else, it's pasal. Let's say the get vafilu l'shem goya. Even if the get was written not for a person, but it's written for a goy, right? For a woman that's a goya, nami pasal, the get is pasal. Now, any get cannot be written for a goyish woman. So it's so off the ballpark. So why, when a get is written for a goita, the get is pasal, even though being written for a goita is way off base, and yet when you say an animal that's shachtel l'shem chulan, it's kosher, even though it's way off base. And says the Gemara Vashani, it's very different. If a get, it's written for a goya. Imagine we ignore dal goya minei. If you ignore that it was written for a goita, right? At best, havale stama. It's a get now with nobody in mind. But we learned ustama apostle. If you had no intention for anybody, if you wrote Jane on the get and you didn't have anybody in mind, the get is puzzle. But kachim, Dal chulmine. If even if you take away the chulin and you look at it as a stam, right, that he didn't have anything intention, havele stama, it's a regular non-intentional carbon, which he didn't think about anything. And we learned before, stama ksherim. By carbon, if you don't say anything, if it's a chatas and you don't say anything, the chatas is kosher. So that's what it is. So that's why chulin doesn't ruin a chatas. Now, just visualize what's going to happen over here. Again, the question that the Gemara has over here, which seems strange, counterintuitive, means that if the Brisa says that if you shecht an animal for an oila, it's a chatas animal. As you can see in the bottom, it's red chatas. You shecht it as an oila, it's no good. If you shecht it off base and say it's going to be chulin, then it's a good. So then the Gemara is going to ask, I'm just going to speak it outside. So we know that in a kli cheres, if you have a mouse in a kli cheres, like dangling a mouse in a kli cheres, all the food that's in the kli cheres becomes tamei. Anything in the airspace of a kli cheres is tamei. That's a pasuk kol asher b'soicha yitma. But what happens if you create a new airspace? The mouse is you put one keli within another keli. So even a keli that could be makabel tuma from the outside. So the mouse is in the outer teicha, and the food is in the inner teicha. So then we say that this new teicha is the food is kosher. The food doesn't become tamei. And the question is why? Since a new keli is like so foreign to the to the outside keli, we should view the new keli as if it's non-existent, and the mouse should be mitama the food. Just like you say, chulin doesn't exist, and so it reverts back to a chatas. Say the same thing over here. We just should ignore the inner keli because no one puts an inner keli into an outer keli. Why would you do that? So let's view it as if it's not here, and the mouse should be mitama the food. So the Gemara is going to say, no, sometimes you put an inner keli in an outer keli, and therefore it's the same type, and it's going to be an interruption. Now, let's read it inside. The Gemara says, Rami Milsa Achrita. Let me ask you another question. Mi Amar Rav, Yehuda Amar Rav, did Rav Yehuda Rav say, Schachtas shachtel shem oila psula, shachtel shem kulim kshera, right? Alma. So we see from that idea, the mina machraba, if you make it as a chatas that you're shechting as an oila, so it's oila is like a carbon. So that interrupts the chatas that it was, and therefore the animal's puzzle. But if you say l'shem chulin, something so off base, the loy mina, it's not even in the ballpark. Loy machrav, but it doesn't destroy the original intention, which is a chata. So therefore, it's kosher. Vatanya, we learned to the brisa toichai. If the food is inside the kli cheres and there's a sheretz there like a mouse, then even the food becomes tamei. Even if it's an inner keli, if it's the inside of a keli, and you put another keli inside of that, as you saw in the picture, so then even if the inner keli is a type of keli that could normally be mekabel tumah from the outside, but it's not makabel tuma. A keli is not makabel tuma in the aver of another keli. So matzah, it will save the food in the inside. The question is, one keli inside another keli should be foreign, and so we should view the inner keli as non-existent. And says the Gemara of Shani, we answered, no. One keli and one keli is like an oila versus a chatas. So that is, it's one of the kind. Shana also chulin eitz kachem, but chulin eitz kachem is much more removed. It's kemechitza eitzel taner. Like if you put a partition within a oven. The Gemara gives you a case like this. I'm going to show you a picture. I'll give you a case. I have colored pictures, but the easier one is the non-colored picture. You have a strange thing. You have an oven. Here's the oven on the right side. And what you have here is a mouse on one side, or a lizard. And then you put up a partition, and then you have food on the other side. So here, since no one puts like a partition in a oven like this, why should you put a partition? So therefore, we view it as it's not there, and the lizard could be matama the food. And same thing over here. The other case, if you put a holy basket, it has holes in it, and it has a lizard inside of it, it could be matama in the food in the tanner. And it's not like toich toichai, because it's very foreign, and that's what chulin and kachim. But it's so foreign, we look at it as non-existent. That's what the Gemara says. The Tanan, we learned in the Shani, ma mechitza eitzatana, just like a partition in an oven, loy mahanya klal doesn't help at all, and everything is tame. Af chulin eitzel kachim loy mahanya klal. The chulin is not. We ignore the chulin when something was originally kachim. Tanan, we learned in the Mishnah, Chanach shechatzusoy b'nesoyim beriyas v'nitzah sheretz b'malkam echad hakol tamei. If the chana was partitioned with boards, then everything is tamei. If the sheretz was found in one area. Kaberesh shuhi pesuch pechusa pekuka b'kashim shesh la'avi atana sheretz b'seicha atana tamei sheretz b'tana eichlim sheb'seicha tameim. As you saw in the picture, that the sheretz was inside of it, in the basket. If the sheretz is inside of the basket, then everything is tamei, even what's inside of the oven. So we see that it doesn't, it's foreign, and therefore we ignore it as if it doesn't exist. Now the Gemara interrupts. Rab Lezer matar. Rab Lezer, the Mishnah says it's tar. It does interrupt. Amar Rab Lezer, I'll make you kal v'choyma. Mahim hitzel b'meis hachomer like tatzel b'klei charis hakal. If you have a partition in a house and there's a mace in one room, and a wall that divides to the next room is not tamei. So if it divides in a house, in a severe tumor like tumas hameis, why wouldn't a partition work in an oven to separate tumas sheretz? And therefore, Reb Lezer says it works. Amar loy loy, it's not true. The Chachamim answered. We go to Amid Beis. Im hitzel b'meis chamesh shekein chaluka b'ayalon. Tatzim b'kli cheres hakal shein chaluka b'ayalim. By mace, when you put a partition in a wall, partitions a wall to make it two separate tents, two separate rooms. In a klicheres, when you put it in a partition in an oven, there's no such a thing of a room A in an oven and room B in an oven. So therefore, the partition is ignored. So the Gemara says like this: Hatin lech Rabbanan. It's very good according to Rabbanan that you have a good example. Chulin and kachim is like the partition in an oven, which is non-existent. We view it as non-existent. But according to Rab Lezer, the partition is existent. It exists, and because it exists, so maybe chulin and kachim, chulin would interrupt the kachim. According to Rab Lezer, you would say if you say the chata should be a chulin, it should invalidate the carbon. Just like it invalidates the Gemara invalidates the partition is a good partition even in an oven. Answers the Gemara, Rab Lezer kal v'choyma. The reason why a partition works in an oven because Rab Lezer had a kal v'choyma. If it works in a house, it should work in an oven. So the Gemara asks back. Then you could say the same thing. Hasanami lema kal v'choyma. You could say a kal v'choyma. Kachim echal and kachim. An oila could updo echatas. If you say oila, it could ruin the whole thing. Chulin like kashkin. So if you're going to say that it chulin, if you say it's going to be chulin, certainly you could uproot it that it was chatas. Ella no svara. The Gemara says, let's go back to square one. Tama de Rabbi, the Rav Rab Lezer. Rav holds like Rab Lezer. The Amar Rab Lezer said, my Tama de Rav. What is the reason of Rav? And then the question of Rav is, Rav said that if you shech a chatos and you say it's an oila, the chatas is invalid. But if you shech the chatas and say it's chulin, it's valid. Why is it so? It's exeris akasiv. Lo yichalus kachim b'nei Yisrael esas yirim el Hashem. Kachim mechalan and kachim, then chulin mechalan and kachim. Only kachim could destroy a kachim, but chulin does not uproot a kachim. Kachim uproots another kachim, but a chulin cannot uproot kachim. So therefore, that's the Gzeira pasuk of Rav, and that's it. So we see from here, Asakra apke kal v'choyma. The pasuk, even if you have a kal v'choyma, that it should work. That if a kachim cannot be mekal kachim chulin loy kolshkein, but the pasuk uproots that idea. So the Gemara asks the question according to Rabbi Lezer hachinami. Let us say also leisi toiche lapke mekal v'choyma. Let's have a toiche and uproot the kal v'choyma. Rabbi Lezer had a kal v'choyma that a partition should work in an oven. He has a kal v'choyma that should be valid to separate an oven. Because if it works in a house, it should work by a mace, it should work by a sheretz. So why don't let Toichai say no? since there's two toichs over here, there's two insides of an oven over here now, that uproots it. You have a pasuk that uproots your kal v'chomer. And say, now, like the Chachamim said, that the whole thing is considered one toich and everything is tameh. Answers the Gemara, Hi Toichim, Rabbi Lezer used Toiche for something else. If you took food and you covered it with mun and you put it into the Aver Atana in the airspace of Atana that has a sheretz there. So I would think that food doesn't become tameh. You can't touch the food because it's covered with mun. It shouldn't become tameh with the avir. That's what Toiche teach me, that if once it's in the oven, it becomes tameh, even though it can't become tameh with tumas nega. But a partition would not be considered like something, you wouldn't darshan Toiche to teach you that idea of loy toich regarding partition being invalid. According to Rabbanan, I don't need the pasuk of Toichet to teach you the concept of a bread being covered by mud, because at the end of the day, it's in the airspace of a tanner. Certainly, it should become tameh. I don't need the pasuk to tell me that it does become tameh. So, what does Toichet teaching you? Toichet v'loy toich. Let's do one more thing and then we'll stop. Rav Yosef Barami Shinei Kodesh Shinei Balam. Rav Yosef Barami asked a stira from Shinui Kodesh, when you change it, the name from what it is, the carbon what it is, to changing the owner. Listen to this. You have a stira, a Rav on the Mishnah. A stira on Rav on himself. Because Rav said, Chatas shechochtos shem chatas. Let's say they're chatas. And you shechting it, that you were supposed to bring it you did an aver of chelav. The guy who's shechting it for you, the kohen, says, I'm shechting you because you did an avera of eating dam, of eating blood. Ksher, that's kosher. But if he says, l'shem oila, I'm shechting the chatas for an oila, psula, then he invalidated the chatas. Alma, the lav mina, machruba. If you do something totally strange, you destroy it. An oila destroys the chatas. The mina, but if you make it from one chatas to another chatas, even though it's not for the same avera, loy machruba, wouldn't ruin anything. Says the Gemara, Rav said, psula. You have a chatas that was shechted on somebody who's mechuyev a chatas. It's psula. Let's say a chatas, you have two people, and the guy he shechted, instead of Ruvain, he shechted it for Shimon, right? So even though Shimon was mechuyev a chatas, but it's not his, he didn't pay for the animal. So pasa, that's pasa. But if you shechted the animal for somebody else who's chayiv and oila, it's kshera, it's kosher. So how could that work? Alma, the bar mina, if you have the same chiv chatas, it's pasul. Because if the same guy is chayiv, if two people are chayiv chatas, and you shechted for the other guy, it invalidates it, even though he's the same type. The lav mina, but if he's somebody else, if the second guy is chuyev mechayev only a carbon oila, loy machraba, he doesn't do any, he's not destroying the original intention. And says the Gemara here will end. Umashani, it can say is a big difference. Hasam, by the first case, chatas sheshachtel l'shem chatas keshera l'shem oila psula. When you change the carbon for what it is from a chatas to a chatas, that's okay. Because the Torah tells you, if you shecht it for a chatas, amar achmona. But it was shechted for shem chatas, albeit you had in mind a different avera. That's good. It's still good. Hacha over here, when you're shechting a chatas for somebody else who's mechuyev a chatas, you're supposed to shecht it for Ruvain, who's chayiv a chatas, and you shecht it for Shimon, the chipper olive. The Torah says that when you shecht the carbon chatas, you have to think of who the owner of the chatas is. Ksiv olav loyal chaveira. You have to think of the owner and not his friend who's also chayiv chatas. Chaveira dumi today. What puzzles that? If your friend was also mechuyev chatas, shemchuyev kampara kamoisa, he was also mechuyev chatas, and so if the kohen had in mind that friend, he invalidates the chatas. But if the kohen would think about another person who's chayiv and oila, which is totally different, then we have no pasuk to invalidate that. That's why if you take the chatas and shecht it on behalf of somebody who's mechuyev and oila, that would still not invalidate the carbon. It would still be a kosher carbon. Okay, we're going to stop over here by Rav Chaviva. We'll catch up tomorrow.